Welcome to Church History for Chumps. My name is John Simon, and I am here with my good old pal,
Thomas Duell.
Thomas Duell. Tell me, how you doing, man?
Doing good, man.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Anything new? Anything exciting that we haven't already talked about?
I don't know. I can't remember if I mentioned this on a previous episode, but I'm finishing up my master's right now.
Look at this guy.
The same program that you did 2 years ago.
Following my footsteps, man.
Yep.
Yeah, love to see
it. So yeah, thankful to be done with that.
I get it. It's
gonna be good for the pod too.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be good. We're gonna, guys, the expansion that we're planning. We're gonna do a Patreon. We're gonna add so many paywalls. You're not gonna be able to listen if you don't shell out some cash. Because let's just say I'm a bivocational pastor, and this is gonna be.
You know what they say about bivo pastors.
That's right. Show me the money.
Gold bricks to the sky in a pyramid formation.
That's right. Yeah. You think those dudes built cathedrals in Europe without being bivocational pastors?
No,
I don't think so.
They were just fleecing their podcast listeners.
That's right. Yeah.
Just be thankful that we're not pretending like we can forgive your sins while we're at it.
That's right. Yeah, we draw the line somewhere.
Thanking us.
Yeah. Hey, dude, I've been listening to a lot of The Chariot lately. Did you ever get into The Chariot?
Honestly, I want to say yeah. I want to be able to say yes, but the answer is no.
I understand.
I
understand.
I followed like one of their band members pretty closely.
Okay.
Like on Instagram for a while.
Yeah.
Stevis.
Okay. I think he's one of their guitar.
Yeah, he's a black dude that's covered in tattoos.
Oh, dude, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Did acrobatics. Like.
That dude was so freaking good. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's fair. The Chariot's been like defunct since like 2013, but there was just a very special time at Solid State Records where they were just pumping out just grimy noise metal, and I don't know. It's matching my mental health right now. It's really nice. Yeah. It's pretty helpful. But hey, Tommy, we got a hefty plate full of content today, don't we?
Yeah.
Well, let's dive in, man. I'm ready.
This is one that we've been wanting to do for a while, and there's a lot of moving parts to it. So I'll just say right off the bat, I'm relying heavily off of a book titled The Magdeburg Confession, and this book was published, I think, back in like 2012. Basically what this is, the story we're going to hear today, is a story that is lesser known in history because this particular confession of faith that we're going to be talking about hasn't been translated into English, I think, until 2012, until this guy, Matthew Colvin, did it.
Oh, wow.
And
shout out to Matthew.
Yeah, so much so that I've talked with Lutherans, because this is a Lutheran story. I've talked with Lutherans who didn't even know about this.
Yeah. Who
are otherwise very knowledgeable about their church history. So
don't sound that knowledgeable to me, but
this feels like breaking, like we're getting to break the story here, at least maybe in the podcast world. So anyway, I'm going to read you the back of this book, remembering that we're relying heavily on the work of Matthew Colvin for this episode. So thank you, Matt, if you ever come across this podcast, which I think there's probably a good chance you will, because there's not really that much online about this topic.
Yeah.
You might find it while you're searching for your own book, like all other authors do.
And if you do, you reach out. You know, we'd love to chat some more.
Hey,
Matt.
All right, so I'm going to read you the back of this book because it's a good intro. In 1548, Charles V imposed his infamous Augsburg Interim, which was an attempt to smash the Protestant Reformation. While all of Protestant Germany conformed to his decree, one city decided to take a stand and resist his authority, the city of Magdeburg. The pastors of Magdeburg issued their Confession in Defense of the Pastors and Other Ministers of the Church of Magdeburg on April 13th, 1550, Anno Domini. 5 months after issuing their confession, Charles V's forces marched on Magdeburg. The people of Magdeburg burned everything outside the city walls and closed the city gates. The siege of Magdeburg had begun. I think that's all I'm going to read from you from the back.
That's a heck of an intro, though.
Yeah. So you kind of gathered what we've got going on here is a fight that's going to occur, or at least some bristling that's going to occur between Lutherans in particular. I think they're like second generation Lutherans. Like some of the people involved here knew Luther personally, but a lot of them are going to be like younger Luther's already passed away.
Yeah.
And Charles V, who's the Holy Roman Emperor.
Okay. So this looks like about 30 years after the Reformation kind of kicked off, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, you're right. Second generation Lutherans. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So to maybe give the cultural background for this so we can understand the weight, we've danced in around the whole Reformation topic from time to time. We've, done our printing press episode. We talked about the Anabaptist controversy. This is going to occur, like you just pointed out, about 30 years after Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses in the year 1517. That kind of starts this big conversation over how to reform the church, whether or not to reform the church, what needs to be reformed, and there's publications flying all over the place.
Do you think Catholics ever make fun of Lutherans by calling it the 95 Theses?
Well, I think that they do say that Martin Luther is burning in hell in feces, actually, so they might.
95 Theses, to be precise.
Yeah.
This is why I don't do color commentary. I'm going to let you get back into it.
No, that was good. I feel like I can't do color commentary, so we only get it when I'm running the show. So
no, dude, you're a great commentary.
All right. So a few years later, in 1521, this is when Martin Luther was condemned as a notorious heretic at the Diet of Worms, which is the moment where basically they decided, the Catholic Church decided that Luther's views were not orthodox, and I think he was maybe even condemned to death. However, he was protected. He was like abducted and protected by Prince Frederick III of Saxony. So this was actually kind of ties in with our topic today, which is ultimately going to be discussing the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, which we'll define more and talk about more in a minute. But this is an example of this this doctrine or this idea being enacted, where you have Prince Frederick, who would be considered like a lesser governor to the Holy Roman Emperor, deciding to resist or oppose in some way this higher authority in order to do what he sees as right, which in this case is protecting Luther. So the Edict of Worms, or basically the conclusion that came from this council, essentially, is that these Lutheran views are not acceptable.
Yeah.
Now, they were able to kind of control aspects of the Reformation that were outside of Germany, but this proved to be really difficult to enforce in Germany. Like the Lutheran project, this reformational project, is going pretty well in Germany, and I don't fully understand all of the kind of political and national dimensions of what this part of Europe looked like at this time, but essentially you had lots of like city-states, as I understand it.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of princes who kind of rule these city-states, and the churches that they oversee, at least they protect, have opted to be like Lutheran.
Yeah, which was interesting, right? Because you would see princes who would convert to a different tradition, and then that whole city-state would kind of morph to follow that, right?
Right.
So there's kind of this ebb and flow of tolerance and persecution based on what flavor of Christian you were.
Right. And dude, there's weird stuff too at this time. Like if you remember when we did the Anabaptist one, you remember we talked about that one city where the city was governed by a guy who was both like the bishop and the magistrate of the city.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that was the case in all of these city-states, but to give you an idea, that's kind of how tightly linked these things were. So Charles V, who's the Holy Roman Emperor, which I feel like we need to do an episode sometime discussing like what this Holy Roman Emperor thing is like in the Middle Ages and going out of it.
Well, Charlemagne?
Yeah, okay. Exactly. So it kind of starts, it gets rekindled at least with Charlemagne, where one of the popes kind of dubs Charlemagne the Holy Roman Emperor, but basically it's like the top king over a good chunk of Europe, and their main job is to protect the Christian faith and to protect the church. And so it's kind of like this, almost like the civil arm of the church, but I think there is some distinction there. Charles V, I think, was the very last one to ever be like crowned by a pope. I think you have Holy Roman emperors that exist after Charles V, but as we know, like a lot of Christendom is disintegrating now, especially with the Reformation. And so I don't know how many we have after this, but he was kind of like the last real one, it seems like.
Well, it's like unified Christendom is disintegrating, but it's like kind of splintering into these little different Christendoms, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So Charles V, he really has a hard time dealing with this German problem because he's already spread thin on many warring fronts. If we were to do an episode on Charles V, we'd like find that he had like fights going on all over the place. It seemed like he liked to pick them. He kind of caused a lot of problems and weakened his influence and authority because of that. And you've got several German princes that were willing to defend their Lutheran lands. And in 1531, so 10 years later, we have the forming of the, let's see if I can pronounce this, the Schmalkaldic League.
That sounded really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Schmalkaldic League. And this was Prince Philip of Hesse and Prince John Frederick I of Saxony. And they're both powerful Protestant rulers in this land. And they basically agreed to protect each other if Charles V were ever to attack them or their lands.
Yeah.
And this worked for 15 years. So then in 1546, we have Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Pope Paul III, who I think had just become Pope, and I think it was 1545. And this is also right when the Council of Trent is going to start doing their work, which is like, I think like a 20-year Catholic Reformation that goes on. This is kind of in response to the Protestant Reformation.
Counter-Reformation.
Exactly.
Yeah, which I've been researching. I want to do an episode on that.
That'd be great.
It's very interesting. And the Council of Trent, is that going to be taking place in Rome?
I don't know where it took place.
Okay.
It definitely was coming from Rome.
Sure. So you're kind of seeing this widespread reaction from the Catholic Church to Protestantism, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Because, we're seeing it from the side of the Pope, who is the religious side. We're seeing it from the side of Charles, who is the political side, and then even like localized areas. So there's a big wave of anti-Protestant stuff happening right now.
For sure.
Okay.
For sure. So like Martin Luther died in 1546. Mm-hmm. You've got Charles V and Pope Paul teaming up to try to quell this Protestant Reformation. Okay. And this is at the same time the Catholics are trying to make some reforms. So let me read you this agreement that Pope Paul III and Charles V entered into. Part of it says, "In the name of God and with the help and assistance of his papal holiness, his imperial majesty should prepare himself for war and equip himself with soldiers and everything pertaining to warfare against those who objected to the Council of Trent, against the Schmalkaldic League, and against all who were addicted to the false belief and error in Germany, that he do so with all his power and might in order to bring them back to the old faith and to the obedience of the Holy See." This is wild. Mm-hmm. So they'd mentioned it's about those who objected to the Council of Trent. So they've already had a council. But probably, I don't know a ton about the Council of Trent, but it's basically, I think that's where they called the doctrine of justification by faith a heretical doctrine. Yep. So they're basically saying, we just said what the rules are. If you are opposed to this, like all Protestants do, we are waging war. And this is the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor together. Oh, dude, This is crazy. Yep. Yeah, this is Stone Cold and The Rock teaming up. Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. So the Schmalkaldic League goes to war. Actually, I want to read one more thing here. So we're not there yet. Sorry. So the Schmalkaldic League goes to war, but then they're quickly portrayed by one of the other kind of rulers in the area. His name is Maurice, the Duke of Saxony. And I'll get to more about Maurice towards the end. But essentially, basically, one guy that was on their side gets offered a special deal from Charles V, and he goes, "Okay, I'm gonna betray these guys in the league." And would you mind plugging this in for me, bro?
Yeah, I got you, Chief.
And so that kind of breaks the power of this league of lesser rulers in the German area and their ability to fight back against Charles. So on April 24th in 1547, there's this big battle that results in the league's forces being defeated, and Philip of Hesse and Prince John Frederick are captured. So now what happens is you've got this Augsburg interim, which is the next year in 1548. Charles comes out and he basically says to these German lands, here's the deal. You can come back into the Catholic faith, the Catholic Church, and we'll make some concessions to you.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. But here's what it's going to look like, and if you don't, we'll kill you. So here's some of the things that this interim allowed for. So the interim demanded that the Lutherans restore the number of sacraments, which the Lutherans had reduced to. They wanted
reduced to or by two?
Two.
Okay.
So they had baptism and the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, there we go.
They wanted them to return to 7 sacraments.
Okay.
And that the churches restore a number of Roman ceremonies, doctrines, and practices which had been discarded by the Lutheran reformers, including transubstantiation. So they wanted that back. The decree also called for the rejection of the doctrine of justification by faith alone, of course, and required that the Pope be acknowledged as the head of the church by divine right.
I love this.
Yeah.
I think it's hilarious. It's like, look, we're not saying you don't have to be Lutherans, but you have to recognize the Pope, you have to add 5 sacraments, and you have to go to Mass.
Yeah.
You have to go to Mass every Sunday. Like,
yeah, exactly.
That's so good.
They had to receive the authority of the Roman bishops. But here's the concession. To the Lutherans, you can get married now if you want.
Like the priests?
The priests, yeah.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
Can have wives.
All right.
Yep. They're like, maybe if we give them some sex, they'll be back in.
All right, I'm willing to go to 4 sacraments.
Take it or leave it. And they said that the laity could be given both elements, bread and wine, in communion, which, remember, had been... We talked about this on the Paid of Communion episode. Basically, the whole Middle Ages, it had been one element. They were just receiving like a wafer. And only the priest would drink the wine.
That's crazy. Oh my gosh. So they're like, all right.
Sex and wine.
They're like, look, we know what you people really want. Yeah. You want to sleep with your wives and you want to, get a little tipsy on Sunday afternoon. That's wild.
I think that's exactly what's going on here, dude. It's hilarious.
Yeah, man.
So, anyway, I think not because that, who knows? I can't dive into the minds of all of the different rulers and church leaders in Germany, but basically what happens is a lot of pastors are imprisoned. Matthew Colvin says that hundreds of pastors were imprisoned, exiled, or executed for refusing to follow the regulations of the interim. So it wasn't that you didn't have lots of Lutheran pastors who were willing to stand up for these things. The problem is that none of their political rulers were willing to defend them over it or to guard them from Charles' forces, except for this one city, and that's Magdeburg.
Interesting.
Yep. So basically what happens, I read it to you at the beginning, this one city, Magdeburg, they decide we're going to resist. So they don't necessarily gear up forces for war. They're basically going to say, we're not just going to lay down and take this. We're going to defend our place.
So the consequence that they've issued is because they didn't declare war on they kind of declared war on the Lutherans, but then they were like, well, if you do these things, which basically means if you return to the headship of Rome, then we'll be cool. And So now I'm assuming some churches did that, and the ones that didn't, they're just getting jailed. But they're not getting are they burning their churches down, or?
I have no idea.
Okay.
It says that a lot of these pastors were killed.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's pretty much.
So there's definitely persecution there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, very interesting. All right.
So you've got a guy named Nicholas of Amsdorf. Did I get that right? Nicholas von Amsdorf.
Okay.
So this is a guy who was with Luther during the Diet of Worms. He was also part of helping protect Luther when that Prince Frederick nabbed him and kept him safe.
Yeah.
And he was there in Magdeburg when it goes under siege. And he, as far as I can tell, is basically the guy who kind of pens this confession that I'm going to now dive into, and is the first signer on it. So basically what goes on is now you've got this siege going on outside of this city, and there's a bunch of pastors inside the city, and they're taking the time while they're under siege to kind of write about what they're doing. It's very akin to a lot of the other writings from the Reformation period, where you've got, like, if you read Calvin's writings, he's appealing to like Roman authorities to basically hear his case. Like, I'm upholding true doctrine here.
Yeah.
We're not trying to like cause problems. This is kind of the feel of this confession. So it's got two parts. The first part of the confession is they basically outline what they believe to be kind of the core tenets of the Christian doctrine. So it's, short statements on who God is, what sin is, what the law is, the gospel of justification by faith, the sacraments, baptism, the Lord's Supper, how absolution works, what the church should look like, how it should be structured, and how the civil government should be structured. So pretty standard fare there. They're just kind of they're saying we're not trying to change anything. In fact, like we're upholding like what Luther, and they esteem him highly, taught us.
Yeah.
The second part of the book is concerning resistance. And this is where they see themselves as, for the first time in history, actually writing down and articulating what they believe is a biblical doctrine that no one has really written about before. They call it the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. And in a definition, let's see if I wrote down a definition for you guys. I didn't write one down, so I'm just going to give you one off the top of my head. In a definition, the doctrine of the lesser magistrate is if someone who is in a position of higher authority is breaking God's law in some way, that those who are in a lesser position of authority have a responsibility and a duty to both resist that authority and protect the people that are in their care.
I pulled up a definition for it, and I think your definition was better than the one that's right here.
Wow, great.
Exactly right, yeah.
Okay, cool. So what they want to be extremely careful of, because they know what they're doing here. They know that by writing this down, they're talking and they're writing about resistance, in particular to authorities. And so they want to be really careful. Let me read you a quote out of the book here. They're making an appeal to the authorities that are above them. When Jesus says they will put you out of the synagogues, and the hour is coming when everyone who kills you will think that he is offering an act of worship to God, they say, in this utterance he also hands down the mark of the false church, that it will spread its religion with weapons. The true church has never taught that men ought to be forced even to true piety by weapons. In the same manner, you yourself allow the Jews and pagans who obey your rule to follow their own religion. You do not force them with weapons to accept yours. We poor wretches, since we are called Lutherans, are more unfortunate than these. Why have we been deprived of this kindness of yours? Together with you, with one mouth and one heart, we preach Christ, our shared Redeemer and Savior, and we embrace all the articles of the Christian faith. We are divided only in this, that to you who have been persuaded so by the papal party, we seem to ascribe to Christ too much of the merit and glory and justification. And because we judge that he ought to be worshipped only according to his own word, while you think that he also ought to be worshipped in more ways, and you force us to worship him according to human traditions. So basically they're saying like, you're using the sword to like force religion here, which has never been the way of the true church. In fact, you're starting to look more like the evil Jews that were persecuted the apostles when you do this, Caesar. And so there's this appeal that's being made, and they see themselves as like men who are going to stand in the courtroom of God as witnesses to give accounts of this ruler who was over them. And it's, you can see that they understood that they were like on paper thin ice here, that they were really close to death, because they even say things like, we are going to accuse you before Christ. If you don't, like, if you kill us, like, we're going to have to tell Jesus what you did. Basically.
I'm going to tell on you so freaking hard. I'm going to tattle all the way to heaven. What's interesting is that it seems like the big, I mean, like, they're very clear in stating their theological differences, but it seems like the big issue is not, I mean, there is an issue in the Catholic Church's esteeming of the papacy and, you know, fill in the blanks. But what it seems like what they're saying is like, you're a crooked church, not just because your theology is wonky, but because you're looking to enforce this bad theology with violence. Like, it seems like they're kind of pleading for like kind of a pluralistic, like, hey, like, we can just do what we're doing and not bother you guys, but the fact that you insist on enforcing by threat of death your doctrine on us proves that you've got the rotten fruit.
Yeah, I'm sure that they wanted the whole church to be reformed.
Of course.
But they also weren't picking up the sword to go force Rome to do it on the other side, nor did they really have that opportunity.
Which a few, you know, kind of rogue reformed folks would do, which, you know, is a big criticism.
And these guys are not revolutionaries, and they seem to be very trepidatious about even writing this stuff down, because they're like, the reason why like the apostles or the early church fathers didn't ever write about this doctrine is because like, what if it gets into the wrong hands, basically? Like, how could it be misinterpreted? While at the same time they're saying this is biblical, what we're doing. And it's really cool if you start to read through their confession. They define what tyranny is, and then they actually ascribe different levels to tyranny. So they're not just saying like, oh, if an authority does something bad, you just get to do whatever you want in opposing them. They're very, very careful to affirm the goodness of government authority and how God has instituted it, and we owe obedience to these authorities by nature of God having instituted it, even when they start to go wrong. And so they establish like levels 1 through 4 of tyranny. It's really interesting. So the first level is they acknowledge that every government authority like makes mistakes because they're humans and they're sinful, and we can't hold this like crazy burden over the head of a government authority that, you know, whenever they make a mistake that they might just expect rebellion from the people that are under them. And it's actually surprising what they consider to be like level 1 tyranny. It's basically even if they were to like cause harm to somebody. Let's see here. If they do injuries to somebody, even I think maybe even leading to death, that are not excessively atrocious or remediable, that's how they put it, then the response from the people under them should be to submit to the authorities, don't take up arms, but warn strongly to repent. So when a magistrate does something wrong that causes harm to people, the people under their care, then like, we need to warn. We don't just be like, oh, it's okay. But the answer isn't to go pick up, you know, your swords and go fight. The next level is when these actions from the higher authority are atrocious and notorious. So this would be like taking away life or property by unjust violence. And in this circumstance, They say that like lesser magistrates, those who are in lesser positions of authority, can resist, but they ought to be careful and to let God be the one who brings vengeance if this concerns like one or just a few people. Sure. So even if the magistrate were to just lose their mind and just like kill some dude that lives in the country, like that's probably not the best time to start a war.
Recognize the line between an isolated incident and like a pattern of behavior.
Right.
Okay.
And also notice here that what they're not calling for is like the people to rise up and resist. What they're doing is they're basically going down the chain of command. Like, if this higher authority, if the sheriff does something bad, then it's the deputy's job to, uphold the rule of law here.
Which is interesting because that's not a disintegration of authority. It's actually just using the lower magistrate in order to keep the higher magistrate in check. It's checks and balances.
Right.
Yeah.
So then level 3 is a situation where a lesser magistrate would have to sin if they disobeyed and didn't defend those in their care. So this one was a little harder for me to understand, but I think this is like a situation where somebody who's in a lower position of authority being ordered to do something that's obviously sinful. And if they were to do that, then it's their responsibility to like not obey.
Yeah.
They give examples of some of these things from scripture, which I'll get to in a second. And then level 4 would be just completely upending the order of what human government is for and punishing the good instead of evil. And in particular, attacking the church. And they're like, if you're doing either of these things, then that's like the height of all tyranny. So the language that we find at the time of the Reformation, at least for what government is for, is to protect the good and to terrorize evildoers. And they actually say, like, if you get that reversed and you do it the other way around, you reverse the order of that, then you're not an authority instituted by God anymore. You're a magistrate of the devil, which is a very Lutheran way of putting it.
Yeah.
So they're really careful when you read through this confession. It doesn't read like revolutionary documents from this time in history where they're just like, we're gonna fight back no matter what. They're just very careful and methodically going, we're just gonna, and you notice they let themselves be besieged. They're not marching out of the city trying to fight. They're just trying to say, hey, like, we're gonna protect our ability to worship God in spirit and in truth. And some of the examples that they use from scripture, I think, are helpful for thinking this through. Probably the one that's been most influential in my mind is in Exodus, the story of the Hebrew midwives who are told by the Pharaoh, hey, you're going to kill any males that are born to the Hebrew women. Yeah. And they lie to Pharaoh about it. And not only do they not kill the babies, but they actually lie to Pharaoh and say that, I forget how what is it they say to Pharaoh? Basically, like,
oh, shoot,
we're not able to get there in time. They're so strong, these Hebrew women, that they have the babies before we get there.
It's very sneaky, it's a very,
right. Yeah. They're deceitful to the Pharaoh, and God smiles on that. Like this,
you know what it was? They told the Pharaoh that, their labor is really quick, and they already had all the babies, and they were already kind of put away and protected.
Yeah.
So yeah,
sweet. So yeah, we don't have any sense that like that was wrong for them to do that. In fact, God smiles on the fact that these women protected the innocent and then lied to this higher authority about it in order to protect them. Like, that's not considered sin by God. Another example would be like Naboth's vineyard. That's the vineyard that King Ahab really wanted, and Naboth is basically like, no, like, you don't get to have it. There's no price that could buy this vineyard from me. It belongs to my family, and Ahab kills him. Like, this is an example of tyranny in Scripture. Another example is kind of outside the the sphere of like civil authority, but it's actually within the scope of a family. They're illustrating what this would look like if you had like a father of a household who decided that he was going to essentially prostitute out his wife and his daughters to men that lived in the city. Not only do the wife and daughters not have to obey that unjust, unlawful instruction from the fathers, hey, submit yourself to this prostitution, they actually have license to like resist that.
Yeah.
So these are examples that they use. Another argument that they make is that when Jesus says to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to render to God what is God's, they actually say Caesar actually falls under this as well, that Caesar owes something to God. They say, Christ, by this same sentence, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. As he subjects other men to Caesar, so he also subjects both them and Caesar himself to God. And he wishes the greatest power among men, as is the power of Caesar, to be especially subservient to God, by taking care that just as Caesar himself, so also the rest of the subjects under his power, should render to God the things that are God's according to his word, and should restrain those who do otherwise. That this is the proper and principal job of a Christian magistrate, and especially that of the highest prince, is here roughly indicated, but is proved more clearly in other ways by our testimonies, arguments, and examples from the Word of God. So they're saying Caesar, or government authority, actually has a responsibility to God here, and if they're not willing to do that, and in fact they're going to persecute the church, then they've done something that at a bare minimum requires resistance. And so they use the example of Lawrence the deacon, one of our favorite episodes that we've done, of a guy who receives an order from the government officials to do something unlawful, and he tricks them and gets rid of the money that they wanted and kind of rubs their face in it while he's at it.
Yeah. I think what I like about this idea is that it gives a biblical license to a very strategic and authoritative kind of dissent, which feels like neat and tidy. I think that when Christians, I mean, and again, we can look at this if we want to look at, the fringe parts of the Reformation where there was violence involved, or even I think of like, an episode that I've been thinking, I want to do this soon. Like John Brown, the abolitionist from Bleeding Kansas. I almost did a
John Brown episode
Dude,
the other day.
we should collab on one.
That'd be cool.
Sick. Well, because like John Brown is an interesting case because this was totally not an example of the lesser magistrate. This was a dude who was like, look, slavery is awful, and if you guys don't believe that, I'm going to kill a bunch of people. And so like I think that Christians, when we're filled with this sense of righteous indignation, if we don't have a proper channel to express that kind of dissent, then it can kind of just bolt out in these really violent
like vigilante
ways.
Justice.
Exactly. I think of the people who, I've had conversations with friends of mine who maybe peers, who would just talk through like the idea of like, I don't know, committing acts of like domestic terrorism, and they wouldn't say it like, oh yeah, let's go do this, but they're like, well, but if you're diminishing a greater evil, isn't it good to do something that's like slightly evil but that crushes a big evil? And it's exactly like that. It's the Punisher, it's complete vigilantism, but also like, how do we square that with our role in Christ's kingdom if we're taking up arms, like literally?
I think what these guys are trying to acknowledge is there is a channel for Ecclesiastes says there's a time for peace and there's a time for war. Like there is times when the innocent need to be protected, and by nature that's going to involve violence. But since that's the case, let's keep it squarely within the channels that God has given the sword to the state, and so let's work through those channels. But let's also be let's like get kind of crazy with our, I don't know, crazy is not the right word, but let's get really solid on our definitions here of like, you know, what are we considering to be tyranny and what's not. Jumping ahead, these ideas greatly influenced John Knox and some other reformers, because if you look up like the doctrine of the lesser magistrate now, you'll probably find a lot of Presbyterian stuff. But the interesting thing is it actually starts with these Lutherans. It also kind of trickles down to like the start of America. Like some of these ideas are swirling around in the heads of the American revolutionaries. So they end their confession with Psalm 93, which says, "The Lord reigns, he is clothed with glory. The Lord has clothed himself and girded himself with strength. He has even established the world which shall not be moved. Your throne is prepared from of old. You are from eternity. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods have lifted up their waves by the voice of many waters. The lifting up of the sea is marvelous. The Lord is marvelous on the deep. Your testimonies have been made very trustworthy. Lord, your holiness adorns your house for all length of days." So ends the Magdeburg Confession.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Have I ever told you about Alec Ryrie's book on Protestants?
No.
Okay. Written by like a Anglican historian. He kind of goes chapter by chapter through a lot of different he goes through a lot of like the different angles of the Protestant Reformation, but then goes into things like the formation of America and the Pilgrims and just beyond, and it's very, very good. But he has this really like brilliant chapter in the beginning where he kind of talks about how the spirit of Protestantism is very like much ingrained in the Western and even more specifically like the American mindset, where I think like as I'm listening to this, being like, it's so interesting being an American because I feel like we naturally have a distrust of authorities. We are naturally kind of drawn to like this pushback. Like I think that Americans more than other countries have this reflex of like, I don't believe that my leaders are qualified or have my best interests in mind. Which is interesting because like I feel like if we're discipling the culture that's around us, I do think this is really solid because I think there's a time for this, just like you were saying, like in the very Ecclesiastes sense. But I almost wonder if like there's another side where it's like, do we make like almost an idol out of this idea of liberty or opposition? Like that's why I liked how you had to define that tyranny was not just, you know, something that imposes on a, you know,
your individual right.
Yeah, but it's like something that is clearly egregious.
Or it's a level of tyranny, but not enough to make you pick up the sword.
Yeah, of course. Like it's egregious to an extent that really ravages the human condition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me read you. Those are good thoughts. Let me read you the postscript right out of this book so we know how the story ends. What happened to these guys?
I've been waiting this whole time.
So the siege lasted for over a year. About 4,000 of Charles's forces were killed, and 468 Magdeburgers lost their lives. The siege ended on November 4th, 1551, with favorable terms for the Magdeburgers. Maurice, so that's the guy that betrayed them before.
Oh, freaking Maurice. Dude.
Now Elector of Saxony, grew tired of being called a, quote, traitor for switching to Charles's side. I thought that's kind of the definition of what a traitor is. For personal gain and private revenge. He was also unhappy that Charles was trying to reimpose Roman Catholicism upon all of Germany and beyond. Finally, he was bothered that his father-in-law, Philip of Hesse, who led the Schmalkaldic League, was still imprisoned 4 years after the Battle of Mulberg, even though Charles had assured Maurice of his liberty. So he's kind of like, this didn't really go how I wanted it to. So he switches sides, thus precipitating the end of the siege. The interim, the one that required the restoration of Roman Catholic sacraments, ceremonies, doctrines, and rule, would not be imposed upon the Magdeburgers. Mm-hmm. Prior to and during the siege, the Magdeburg pastors and other Christians were busy writing. Not only did they produce what is now known as the Magdeburg Confession, but 228 known pamphlets were written, printed by the thousands, and distributed throughout Germany and to other nations during the siege. The Magdeburg Confession and the stand these men took is known to have impacted John Knox, who led the Reformation in Scotland, and Theodore Beza, who was John Calvin's successor. Both of these men would build upon what was written and established there regarding the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. If not for the actions of the Magdeburgers, the entire Reformation itself might very well have been a blip on the radar screen of history. Charles had intended to re-Romanize all of the empire. However, the actions of these reformers clearly led to two very important councils and subsequent treaties. After the siege ended, Maurice of Saxony, along with other German princes, attacked Charles and drove him out of Germany and into Italy. Charles V, tired of civil war, granted religious freedom to the reformers at the Peace of Passau in August of 1552, just 9 months after the siege of Magdeburg had ended. The Peace of Passau granted peace only until another imperial diet could be held. The diet was held in Augsburg in 1555. The result was the Peace of Augsburg, September 25th, 1555, which declared Cuius regio eius religio, whosoever region, his religion. Greatest of all, the siege of Magdeburg produced the Magdeburg Confession, which is the earliest known historical document to lay out in a doctrinal format the lesser magistrate doctrine.
Interesting. So, okay, couple questions.
Yeah.
And then we'll close out because we're a little short for time. My first one is, if you... Okay. I'm going to have Ray edit this out too. This is too long of a pause. Okay, so a lot of the biblical examples, and maybe I missed one or two, the biblical examples were more of like civil disobedience, but not quite like violent disobedience. So how do you feel like you make the jump?
I think that all from the argument of what the role of and I'm speaking from their perspective here, but I think I'm convinced. All from the argument of what is government for. And so remember that they're not calling for like a people's revolt or something like that, of like individual families to take up the sword, but they're saying like, and remember, they're in a political context that's a little different than ours too. And so, if you're in a nation state that's protected and governed by a prince, and then you've got the Holy Roman Emperor saying you've got to do this unbiblical thing, or we're going to kill you. They're saying it's the job of the prince to protect the church and to fight back against that.
Sure.
Which is different than saying we need, get all the pastors together and give them machine guns, like kind of thing. Like it's a different scenario.
So when we think about someone like John Brown, the issue there was that he was a vigilante.
Oh yeah, I mean, I don't think it's even the same thing. They do use examples kind of that boil down to the family, but that seems to be illustrating for them back to the question of like, how should civil authorities be acting? They need to be protecting the innocent, terrorizing evildoers. If the evildoer happens to be a greater authority, then you should be fighting back against them. So yes, it does include violence. But I think biblically we can make this the case that that the state bears the sword.
Interesting.
By God's decree.
Yeah. It's interesting. I remember reading a story, and don't quote me on this because I might be wrong, but I believe Zwingli and Luther were kind of like rivals in the Reformation because they liked the fact that they didn't like the Catholic Church. Luther did not like Zwingli's approach to the sacraments, which was like their big beef with each other. But I remember reading that when Luther found out the manner in which Zwingli had perished, which was kind of maybe not the same, because there wasn't a lesser magistrate. It seemed like this was just him kind of like going toe-to-toe with the empire and then losing. But I remember Luther said something, basically said he was disappointed in how Zwingli went out, saying that essentially what happened was he lived by the sword and he died by it, seeming like he was suggesting that Zwingli's response should have been to die a martyr.
There was something about that in this book where Luther seemed like reticent, even at his time, of like writing down what is now known as this doctrine for fear of like how it could be interpreted. So I'd have to do some more reading before I could answer authoritatively.
But no worries. And it's just an anecdote that I recall, and again, I could be misinterpreting.
I mean, it makes sense if you're the guy that's kind of starting this fire, so to speak, that you would also, if you're a godly man like Luther, be like really, really careful to shy away from any language that would sound like you're trying to lead some sort of violent revolt or something, which he certainly could have if he chose to.
And I think you could argue that Luther, for at least a part of his post-Reformation career, anticipated his martyrdom. I think he thought that the response was going to be he would eventually be jailed and killed for what he had said and done. So,
which would have been the result if a lesser magistrate hadn't opposed a greater one, which I don't think Luther asked for. I think that was other people deciding to protect him.
Yeah, which is kind of the best case scenario. It's just interesting because, we've had a lot of stories where, and maybe the difference is the lesser magistrate kind of seems like this middle buffer that protects the vulnerable faithful versus the oppressive tyrant, essentially. And I think when we look at a lot of stories, whether it's the one we covered a few weeks ago about the 26 martyrs of Japan, or Lawrence the Deacon, like a lot of the times the reason martyrs happen is because there aren't those mediators to kind of step in between. But also I think recognizing that, like, I think I'm feeling a lot of the tension that your dudes had of not wanting to overrepresent this, because then you start to train people into thinking I have to use every resource and suddenly become very pragmatic to stop from receiving oppression and persecution. When we have to remember that the blood of the martyrs is what's that saying? The blood of the martyrs is the soil of the church. That's not the
I know what you're going for.
I'm gonna find it. You can respond to what I'm saying. Seed. It's the seed of the church, not the soil. Gosh dang it. Yeah. So, but that is really interesting. And
I think, it's obviously going to cause tension probably for anybody listening to this, because I think that we want to, obviously lean towards things that don't involve, death and violence. But thinking in the channels of like government and what government is for, I think that's what these guys were trying to do in order to protect even more death from occurring. I mean, they had hundreds of their brother pastors get imprisoned and executed already, and they're basically like, this is crazy. Like, who's gonna like stem this tide? And they even make, I didn't talk about this, they make a case that like they're encouraging people to think like, how do you think it is that tyrants get stopped? Like, what is the means that God intends for tyrants to be stopped in history? And how has God stopped tyrants in history? And oftentimes it's through like nations, like this nation versus nation, or even, internal affairs going on. But they seem to be trying to protect the responsibility of those who are in civil authority to even use the sword to protect people who would be killed by the sword by someone who's in a higher authority. I think at a bare minimum, one of my big takeaways from this, maybe we could end here, is that I think that this, for me, makes me realize the value of ecclesial authority or church authority in a society, in that ideally you would have godly church leaders who have the ear of hopefully godly civil leaders, where like dialogue can take place, and there's like mutual submission going on, so that like we don't get to either tyranny or the sword. Yeah. And I think throughout church history, my mind is kind of blanking a little bit, but like even in the secular realm, the church has always thrived when we've had an advocate in those higher planes. Because remember, like Constantine, the controversial dude that he was, like he was never meant to be
the leader of the church. He was meant to be the advocate.
Yeah.
And there was a huge blessing for the church around that time in history because they had someone who had access to, the pieces of authority that existed, but was considerate of the well-being of the people of God. And by default, not just the people of God, but also the vulnerable and the needy and those who would be stepped on otherwise.
Yeah.
So,
and we could get into this more if we do a Holy Roman Emperor episode, but there's elements of that, of their supposed role that makes a lot of sense to me, where it's like this high position of authority, part of their job is to like protect the church, not to be the church, not to dictate what is true doctrine, but to protect the church from those that would want to attack it or, kill church leaders and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so it makes sense that here we have, regardless of however you feel about that job description, when you have that guy who's supposed to be protecting the church, objectively persecuting and killing people who are saying, we think that we're justified by faith.
Yeah.
Like that's bad.
Yeah. I mean, and even if they pass a law that's like, oh, we're gonna kill every atheist in Arizona, like, the civil magistrates, lesser and greater, should protect the church, but they should just protect human life, because that is the responsibility of the government to stand for all kinds
terrorize
of
the evildoer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So good stuff. Hey guys, thanks for listening.
Yeah.
I've been chatting with a few of you guys on Instagram. Some of you have sent some really great recommendations, and I feel awful because I am so freaking bad at just like getting a recommendation, thinking about it, and actually doing it. I have such great intention. I have such great like goals, but it just doesn't pan out. But keep sending me those, because I've talked to some of you guys about Lottie Moon, who was a Baptist missionary. I wants to do that one. One of you guys reminded me about the Great Schism, which I've told you guys my dream is to do a Great Schism 2-parter, one with a Catholic and one with an Orthodox priest. That's on my bucket list, you guys. So yeah, let me know what you want to listen to, and we'll try to remember. But yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.
God bless you.
See ya.